Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you this morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lydia. I'm one of the school missional chaplains here and the youth pastor here, which is a great fun. And since September, the young people have been on the same kind of discipleship journey that we've been on, and we've been looking at Mark's Gospel in schools throughout the week, on a Thursday at youth group, and also on a Sunday during youth church. And I've been so struck by the wisdom and the insight that these young people have had as we've been looking at these passages. We've basically been reading a passage with them and seeing where they take it. And the discussion has been led by them, and it's been really exciting. And this really familiar gospel has really come alive again to me. Watching Jesus be revealed and made alive to these young people has been amazing. In St. Hilda's, one of our high schools that we work in, we run a group on a Tuesday called E220, which stands for Ephesians 2:20, with Christ as our chief cornerstone. And this group is one of our Christian Union groups, and we've had a young person who was invited by their friend to come along to the group. And on his first week there, he heard the story in Mark 2 about Jesus forgiving and healing a paralyzed man. And he was really moved. And then he came back the next week. And for the first time, Jesus was becoming alive to him. And when he came back the week after, he heard the parable of the sower. And he said this to us. We wrote it down because when he said it, we were like, whoa, that's amazing. He said, coming here was the best decision of my life. I'm never going to regret it. No one told me that God loved me, and I didn't believe in God before, but now I do. And I think that makes me a disciple. I think that makes me a disciple. He'd caught it. Jesus was real and alive to him. He knew that God loved him. He knew that God was real. And he'd caught something of this discipleship journey in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks. That's all he'd done. And as I've read through our passage for today, and I've been preparing, I'm convinced that the same can be true for us today. That Jesus can be made alive to us through this gospel. That we can know that God loves us and that we can be a disciple. You know, it wasn't overly complicated to this lad. You know, he hadn't been on years of theology training and really understood the concept of being a disciple. He just caught Jesus and his love for him. So at the beginning of our passage, we find the disciples in a really familiar situation. As I've been talking to people and they've been, oh, what are you preaching on? What's in the passage? And I've said, oh, so it's the feeding of the 4,000. And without fail, every time they've said, the 5,000. I said, no, Jesus feeds the 5,000, then he does the 4,000. And they're really close. They're really close. It's Mark 6, he feeds the 5,000. And here we are in Mark 8, where he feeds the 4,000. And it's a situation where they faced only a couple chapters before. Jesus is teaching a crowd of thousands. They need feeding, and there isn't much food to go around. It's familiar, right? We've heard this story before. The disciples have just seen and experienced, and not just have they seen Jesus do it, Jesus actually got them involved. They've been part of this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. They've seen Jesus feed thousands with a small amount. They collected the 12 baskets of leftover food. They got to participate in the miracle really recently. And here they are again. They're faced with the same problem, but they also have the same Jesus with them. And the questions come. The doubt comes. Where are we going to get this food? How are we going to feed all these people? What are we going to do? Jesus, what are you going to do? How are you going to solve this? They seem to have forgotten. They seem to completely not be able to recall what Jesus did with the 5,000. They're failing to understand what is going on. But I do think that sometimes we're a bit harsh with the disciples. We're like, how are they not getting this again? Are they this slow that they're missing the point again? Isn't it obvious? I did this passage this week in Archbishop Blanche, and the girls in CU were outraged. They were like, what is going on with these disciples? Why haven't they got it? Like, they were so frustrated with these disciples. Like, they just couldn't figure out why these disciples didn't get it. Why don't they see who Jesus is? Why don't they remember how he provided for them? Why have they forgotten already? But we forget that we have the whole story with us. We have a completed Bible. And these disciples were living in it. They didn't know. And nothing like this had ever happened before. No man had walked like this and done these things that Jesus was doing. This was life-changing, and it is life-changing. It was groundbreaking. Jesus is healing many. Jesus is preaching a new gospel. Jesus is raising the dead. Jesus is feeding thousands with small amounts. Jesus is walking on water. Jesus is calming storms. Jesus is loving all. This is groundbreaking. This is new. Mark writes in Mark 1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. This was new. And so I think we can give the disciples a little bit of grace, although it is frustrating when they miss the point about 1,000,000 times. But nothing like this had ever happened before. And we see that Jesus continues to have compassion on the people who are following him. He's aware and he's sensitive of their needs. And sometimes in unexpected ways, often in ways that broke through the tradition and the laws of the day. We only need to look back to Mark chapter 5, where Jesus heals the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, to see Jesus' compassion and how he goes beyond social norms and the law to meet needs. And the same is true for us today, that Jesus continues to have compassion on us. And sometimes it's really hard to trust God. Sometimes we find ourselves like the disciples. What is going to happen? How is Jesus going to do this? In seasons of pain, of sickness, seasons where life feels so overwhelming, when it feels like anxiety has got us in such a tight grip. When we receive news that's hard to hear, when we're praying and praying and praying for something and nothing seems to be changing, when the storms of life hit, when just like the disciples, we're just not sure how Jesus will provide. We're just not sure how he's going to do this miracle in our lives. We're not sure how we're going to get through our situation. When just like the disciples, our life circumstances have made us forget the stories of provision and hope. But the grace that we have in our forgetfulness, in these seasons that we have, is that we have a God who keeps reminding us again and again. Jesus didn't lose his rag with the disciples when he said, how are you going to feed these 4,000? He didn't go, do you know what, forget it. I'm not even going to show you how I would do it. I'm not going to do it. They can go hungry, whatever, because you have missed the point again. He has compassion on the disciples, compassion on the people. He reminds them. He shows them. And the disciples get to participate in this miracle as well. You could imagine Jesus saying, well, you can sit and watch, but you can be quiet because you're obviously not getting this. But he brings them in again. He says, get your baskets, collect the food again. Just like the disciples. It's something we see throughout the Bible and throughout our own lives and the lives of those around us. The miraculous provision of God. And we all have stories of miraculous provision. And sometimes we just need to ask God to remind us, hey God, can you remind me how you showed up last time? Can you remind me? Because God doesn't want to leave us here in our frustration and in our questioning and in our confusion. There is grace here. There is love here. You know, the Psalms talk about a God who is like a shepherd, who leads us to a spacious place where we can catch our breath. And maybe today, you need to take a moment to breathe out and recognize who Jesus is. Like really practically, you just need to take a breath and remember and let God remind you. Because you're not a failure if you're struggling to recognize. Because the disciples weren't failures for failing to recognize. There was grace for them, and there's grace for us here today. Here, now, even in the mystery. Jesus is trustworthy. I wonder what your least favourite subject was in school. For me, it was definitely maths. And my parents are here, so they can testify that I was not very good at maths. In fact, when I asked my dad to read through this preach, he said to me, with a very serious look on his face, "Are you sure you want to leave this bit in about the maths? Are you sure you want people to know how bad you are at maths?" And I was like, yeah, it's fine. But because he was there for the journey of me trying to get through my maths, he said, "Are you sure? Listen, it's no secret. Ask me to do some maths for you and you'll soon find out that there's just something about it that I just couldn't get into my head, right? And no matter how hard I tried, and no matter how many times it was explained to me, I just really struggled to understand it. And I remember the despair on my teachers' faces when yet again, after the 20th or 30th time of them explaining Pythagoras' theory to me, I still didn't get it. In fact, when I was writing this, I had to say, what is that theory about someone with the letter P? Like it's not in here. I don't know where it is. I just couldn't get it. And I wonder if Jesus had the same look of despair on his face in that boat with the disciples when he's like, "You haven't understood this." And they're like, "Guys, it's because we forgot the loaf of bread." And Jesus is like, "What are you talking about? That's not what I'm saying to you." I wonder whether Jesus had that same look of despair on his face while he was sitting with them disciples in the boat. And yet again, they haven't understood. And you know, in this passage, when Jesus is asked for a sign and the disciples are failing to understand, Jesus doesn't just give them the answer. You know, he could have said, "Right, here's what it means. Here's exactly what it means." But he doesn't do that because a good teacher teaches, right? They don't just give the students the answer. Because students don't learn anything that way. You know, my maths teacher could have given me all of the answers to my exam, but I wouldn't have learned any. I mean, did I learn anything? I'm not sure. But I wouldn't have learned anything if they just handed me the answers. I wouldn't have learned anything because students don't learn anything that way. Which I think is why Jesus tells them that he won't give them a sign. He isn't being harsh with them. He's saying to them, "Listen, I'm not going to pull a rabbit out of the hat for you right now because there are signs. I am showing you that I am the way, the truth, and the life. And if you have open eyes and open ears and open hearts, you'll see what I'm doing. If you follow me, if you join me in this journey, you'll see what I'm doing." And we see as we go on through this chapter that this starts to happen for the disciples. They start to put the pieces together. They start to say, "Oh, Jesus is this Messiah that we've been waiting for. Jesus is the one who's been prophesied about the whole way through the Old Testament." Jesus is showing the disciples throughout this passage of how clear he wants this faith life to be for them. That there is a simplicity of how we come to Jesus. That all Jesus is requiring from a disciple is for us to come and to follow. The other week, me and Mike were doing some baptism prep with our young people at youth group, and I shared with them that if they were waiting until they had all of their faith figured out before they got baptized, well, that they would never get baptized, really. And if they were waiting to be perfect before they got baptized, they probably wouldn't get baptized ever. And actually, that's not what Jesus is asking them for. He isn't waiting for them to be perfect before they take these steps. Because we come to Jesus with all of our stuff, all of our questions, all of our doubt, all of our mess. When Jesus called the disciples, Jesus wasn't waiting for them to be perfect before he called them to follow him. Because if he did, he wouldn't have called any of them. And he certainly wouldn't have called Peter. And he definitely wouldn't have called Judas. He wouldn't have called them to follow. He probably would have done his ministry by himself. And he might have got through things at a bit of a quicker rate. And he might not have had to have that despair in the boat with the disciples when they're chatting about bread and they're not understanding. But he knew that what the disciples would go on to do. He saw a future in them. He saw opportunity. He saw people to follow him, people that he loved, people who would go on to build and to be. And I think that Jesus knew that getting to do his ministry with the disciples would be more fun, that it would be better to do it together. And today, Jesus is calling us. He's calling you, and he's not calling you to have it all figured out. But he's calling you to come and to follow. Bring your stuff with you. Bring it to the one who can redeem and restore. Because Jesus is the one, the only one who can deal with our stuff. And we all have stuff. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. You know, we all carry stuff around with us. And Jesus is calling us and saying, hey, bring that to me and let me deal with it. And follow me. Because he's the only one who restores, who redeems, who makes us whole again. I'd love to invite the band to come back up. You know, something that struck me from that quote from that young person is that he didn't overcomplicate what it meant to be a disciple. So let's not overcomplicate what it means. Because when we start to overcomplicate it, we start to count ourselves out. We start to say, oh, well, if this is what it means to be a disciple, maybe I can't do it. Maybe I can't do it. Today, Jesus wants to make it clear to you that he is the Messiah, that he loves you, that he cares about you. Just as it became clear to that young person, God wants to make it clear for us who he is and what he wants to do in our lives. I want to remind you of that quote. Coming here was the best decision of my life. I'm never going to regret it. No one told me that God loved me, and I didn't believe in God before, but now I do. And I think that makes me a disciple. I think that makes me a disciple. You know, I'm confident that when we come to Jesus and we follow him, we can say the same. I'm never going to regret it. Never going to regret it. So I'd love for us to stand as we respond. And really my question for us today is, what do you need to do to recognize that Jesus is Lord? What do you need to do to recognize that Jesus is Lord? You know, for some of us, we just need to take a breath. We need to breathe out and recognize that Jesus is who he says he is, that he loves you, that he cares for you, that you can be a disciple, that he holds you. Breathe and recognize that Jesus is who he says he is. Maybe you're struggling to recognize. Maybe you're in that season where you just can't see the way forward. You can't see how God is going to do it again. You can't see. And maybe you need to ask God to open the eyes of your heart again, to remind you of his provision. We're going to have prayer ministry over here. And if anything's kind of resonated for you today, or you just need prayer, please come and see someone on the team. When I was preparing, I was thinking about both of the feedings, the 5,000 and the 4,000, and how, both times the food, it looks inadequate for the size of the crowd, right? Like, how is 7 loaves going to do anything for 4,000 people? How? And maybe today you feel like your resources, what you have, feels inadequate. But I felt Jesus say, that's his problem and not yours. How much food there was Jesus' problem to deal with. And we give what we have into his hands, and we watch as he performs a miracle, as he multiplies it. We offer it to Jesus to do whatever he wants with it, and we're ready to distribute it at his command. But the size of the resource is Jesus' problem and not yours. And so if you feel like, I feel God calling me, but I really don't have much to give, well, Jesus is calling you, and what you have is his problem and not yours. Just give it to him and let him multiply it. Let him do the work.